Good afternoon. My name is Danielle Dart, and on behalf of the Minnesota Historical Society, welcome to Knowing Our Worth, Native Women Changemakers, a conversation hosted in connection with the Minnesota Historical Society's Votes for Women digital project. Today's program with Dr. Jill Doerfler, Jayme Davis, and Nevada Littlewolf is the final installment in a three-part series featuring Native, Latinx, Black, and Asian women who are at the vanguard of social and political change in a year when we are marking both the centennial of the 19th Amendment and the historic 2020 elections, in which Native women ran for office in record numbers, shifted the outcome of races at the municipal, tribal, state, and national levels, and helped elect the first woman to the White House. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the Minnesota Historical Society is located on the ancestral homelands of the Dakota people and the historical territories of the Ojibwe and Ho-Chunk peoples. We pay respects to their elders past and present and center ourselves in these truths today. We will start today's program with a conversation between our panelists, then move to your questions, which you can post at any time they come to mind in the comments. So if somebody says something you want to ask a question about, put it in the comments. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dr. Jill Doerfler. She is professor and department head of American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota Duluth. She holds a BA in history from the University of Minnesota Morris and a PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota. She is the author and co-author of numerous scholarly books and articles focused on Native American identity, citizenship, history, and governance. Dr. Doerfler grew up on the White Earth Reservation here in Minnesota and is a first-degree descendant. Her research is premised on her commitment to bridging scholarly efforts with the practical needs of American Indian peoples, communities, and nations. She actively participated in constitutional reform efforts at White Earth for nearly a decade, and from 2016 to 2020, she co-coordinated and participated in a Minnesota Chippewa tribe-wide grassroots education project designed to empower people to be full participants in their tribal governments and in Native nation rebuilding. Welcome, Dr. Doerfler.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you so much for having me today and this program. I'm going to start with introducing the other panelists before I lead into today's topic. So first, let me introduce Nevada Littlewolf. She is a citizen of the Leech Lake Nation and has over 20 years experience working across sectors of politics, community, philanthropy, and business. Throughout her professional life, she has always worked with diverse and intersectional communities to advance equity. She is a former elected official serving on the Virginia City Council from 2008 to 2018 on Minnesota's Iron Range. Nevada was the Minnesota political director for the 2020 Biden-Harris presidential campaign. She and the Minnesota team secured Biden's victory here, which eventually led to the national win. She is the executive director and campaign manager for Our Children, an organization leading the campaign to pass the Page Amendment, which is a Minnesota constitutional amendment that would ensure quality public education as a right for all children. Her perspective and strong expertise in electoral politics, community organizing, and public policy is a formidable combination for systems of change. She serves on several boards, including the Women's Foundation of Minnesota, Clearway Minnesota, and the Minnesota Urban Debate League. She has a Bachelor of Fine Arts from the University of Minnesota Duluth, a really excellent institution and organization, if I may say so. And she is currently an MPA student at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. She was a 2016 Bush Fellow. Welcome, Nevada. Next, I'll introduce our other
Thank you, Jill.
Jayme Davis. Jayme is Anishinaabe and Hunkpapa Lakota and a citizen of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa, where her father, Dr. Jim Davis, is from. She also has deep roots in Standing Rock, where her mother, Lyda Davis, is from. Jayme is the program director for the Native Governance Center, which is a Native-led nonprofit based out of Minneapolis. They assist Native nations in strengthening their governance systems and capacity to exercise sovereignty through leadership development, and tribal governance support. Prior to her work at the Native Governance Center, Jayme was the Career and Technical Education Program Director at the Turtle Mountain Community College. Before that, she was the Native American Affairs Liaison for the former North Dakota Senator Kent Conrad in Washington, D.C., which is where she fell in love with strategy and policy work. Jayme received her bachelor's degree in business management from the University of Mary and is currently working towards her MPA, Master of Public Affairs, with a concentration in federal Indian law and sovereignty from the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. She is a proud member of the Cohort 7 Native Nation Rebuilder Program and also Cohort 7 Rural Leadership North Dakota Program. Jayme also was just appointed as Rural Leadership North Dakota to their board as a council member. So welcome, Jayme, as well. Thank you both so much for joining us today. I want to start with a little round of thank yous to the Minnesota Historical Society for inviting us and providing us this platform today. They have adapted to the pandemic in really excellent ways, bringing this and so much great programming and information to become easily accessible to viewers online, both today and archived for the future. So we really appreciate that. I also want to say miigwech, thank you to everyone for taking a time out of their busy day to join us. And I hope that this will be a very interesting conversation. 2020 has, of course, been a momentous year in so many different ways. Today, we're going to focus on American Indian participation in the American political system and also in tribal political systems. American Indian nations remain largely invisible in American society today. This is something that's slowly changing, and in election years like this where we have tight election margins, it tends to be one of those times where the general public sees an occasional glimpse of American Indians on the national stage. So that's helpful. And of course, programming like this, also allowing us a platform to talk about these issues, really helps to change and just add American Indian voices to the conversation. So before we get into the 2020 elections, I want to acknowledge here the complexity of American Indian citizenship. And we have a graphic here to nicely illustrate this. And I credit the National Congress of American Indians for their beautiful work here. Many American Indians have a triple citizenship. So citizenship in their tribal nation, citizenship at the federal US level, and then state citizenship as well. And so these are distinct and yet interrelated. So it creates this kind of complexity for lots of Native people when it comes to political participation. So great. Let's go ahead and move into talking about the importance of political participation within tribal nations, within those governing systems. And then we'll get into the American political system in a few minutes here. So as many, but maybe not all of our viewers might know, American Indian nations have their own systems of government. There are nearly 600 American Indian nations within the US, meaning there's a vast, vast diversity of systems of tribal governance. And so we're just going to skim the surface in some ways here and give a few broad examples and talk about participation in those tribal political systems. So tribal political systems have their own election cycles and their own different positions of leadership based on, typically on their constitutions, the way in which the government is structured. Just like we've had changes in the US over time, there has been changes in Native governance systems over time as well. But taking a look and thinking about current governing structures for American Indian nations. Jayme, that's something that you, in your position at Native Governance Center, you work closely with Native nations on this idea of nation building and making systems of governance that are effective for tribal nations. Would you talk with us a little bit about tribal elections? Give us an example, perhaps, of internal tribal elections, how they work, when they're working at their best, and what they're like.
Sure. Yes. Thank you, Jill. First, happy to be here with y'all today. So at Native Governance Center, we work with the 23 Native nations that share geography with the states of Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. Within those 23 nations, give a little data here. I love numbers and facts and figures and stuff. So within the 23 nations that we serve, there's 201 elected positions. We track those nations and track those positions as well. This year alone in 2020, 17 nations had their elections and 98 of those seats were up for grabs. So next year is another election cycle, 7 nations with 50 seats up. And in 2022 is not only another big year for city, state, county elections, but it's also another big year for the nations that we work with. There will be 16 Native nations that have their elections with 106 seats up again. So, you know, I say all this to give you an idea of how leadership can change within our nations. For example, my nation here in Turtle Mountain, we have 9 council seats total, and they are up every 2 years. We just had an election this November, and so in 2022, we will be part of the 16 that have their elections again. But then there's other nations like Standing Rock, where my mother is from, where they have an executive council, at-large council, and then their council representatives, and they have staggered terms, staggered election cycles, I should say. So the goal there is to help create stability with those staggered terms within the government. So in 2021, Standing Rock will have 11 of their 17 seats up for election, and then 2 years later, I believe, they will have 6 seats up. So there's the staggered terms. So we at Native Governance Center, we track this because we want to support and be of resource for each of these nations during and after these transitions, so they are strengthened to lead their nations and exercise their sovereignty as they see fit. Because, you know, we believe that there's nobody else in this world that know their nations better than the homegrown leaders do. So we at Native Governance Center are all in for it, and we are in service in any way we can be. So yeah, that's a little bit about the election cycles that we track and a couple of examples of how they can differ.
Excellent. That's a great snapshot. And those numbers really help put things into perspective of the scale and the scope and the number of elections that Native people are participating in and the distinct differences. So as you noted, some Native nations have their elected leadership turnover every 2 years, which is a pretty quick cycle in a lot of ways. One other thing that I've noticed with a lot of Native nations is we don't see term limits. And so sometimes even with lots of elections or quick election cycles, we can still see sometimes stability if there is an official who has garnered sort of long-term, have built a reputation and garnered long-term support. But they're always held accountable really quickly to the people as far as they're up on the ballot again soon.
Right. Yep, definitely. Yeah. There's all kinds.
Would you talk a little bit about political participation, how you've seen that across different Native nations as far as election turnout or efforts to have people participate in tribal government structures?
Was that for me?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was for Nevada. How Natives participate in other political structures, that was the question?
I'm thinking about how some of the work that Native Governance Center has done to build capacity, I guess, within Native nations so that people are inclined to participate in tribal political structures or building leadership capacity within those structures is where I'm kind of leading.
Okay. Yeah, so we do it in two ways, actually. We have a leadership program that we run called Native Nation Rebuilders, which mentioned Cohort 7 alumni. We have a few of our employees that are fellow rebuilders, but that program really, really helps in knowing that there's another way to go about this process, right? There's a standard approach and the nation building approach. So it talks about like capable governing institutions, making sure you have that cultural match. We just got off a phone call with a webinar that we'll be doing on spirited leadership, a strategy, that strategic orientation, which I love. I love, that 7-generation mindset that, we all believe in. But how do we get there? Through, exercising our sovereignty. So, through that leadership program really pieces together all of that. And the people that apply for this program are normally on a path to either running for either a tribal position or a state position. We have a number of rebuilders at many levels of, council members, chair people, presidents, Senate, just a variety of capacities that they serve. And so we also run that. We have a youth leadership program that we're currently still developing. And then the other side of that is our governance work that we do. So we are working towards building programming in ways that can help during these transition times of when newly elected leaders come in and kind of like, what did I get myself into here? And how do I navigate all of this, right? Because it's a big undertaking. And what does that leadership look like? And, pulling your leadership skills out to the forefront. Because, some of them are doctors, teachers, lawyers, and then you become a tribal council member. It's a different type of leadership when you're leading your nation. So we are creating programming in and around that as well. So that's, I guess, a little bit of how, we definitely, want to focus on strengthening, yes, voting, getting out, running for these positions. But when you're in these positions, how can you be strong and how can you be, making big moves for your nation?
Excellent. Yes. Thank you so much. Yeah. I think this ties in Nevada with some of your experience as well. Maybe you would share with us a little bit about your own experience within the tribal governance world, participation in tribal governments, as well as some volunteer work that you've done with the Zagi Bagam project.
Thank you, Jill. Miigwech. It's hard to follow Jayme Davis, but yeah, I think that the graphic that you showed earlier was really fantastic because it really does show Native folks as like really being, like we are the most legislated people in the country. I mean, because we operate with federal government, state government, and our tribal government, right? And I know we're going to talk more about American public political systems next, but in terms of like our tribal political systems, like myself, I've spent most of my life living off the tribal lands, outside of the boundaries of Leech Lake Nation. And as a tribal citizen, I'm still like vote, for tribal elections. And while I'm not within the tribal boundaries, I cannot run for office there. But in the future, if I move within the tribal boundaries, I'd be able to run for office within the tribal nation. And there are just other ways for folks, Native folks and Native women to stay engaged in tribal political work, even if you're not running for office. I think all of the great work that Native Governance Center does and Jayme does around prepping leaders and helping leaders and getting folks to run for tribal office is super important. Just as important, I think, as those of us who are living in other places that still want to remain engaged with our tribal communities and impacting our government. So one way that I have remained engaged is actually through an effort that Dr. Jill Doerfler has led up, which was the Zagi Bagong effort, which had to do with education around the Minnesota tribal constitution. And so Leech Lake Band is one of the 6 bands that belong to the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. And so, it's Leech Lake, White Earth, Mille Lacs, Bois Forte, Grand Portage, and Fond du Lac. And what a lot of people don't know is that we're all governed by the same Minnesota Chippewa tribal constitution, even though each band is sovereign and has, runs their own government and has their own elected officials. We all operate under this kind of umbrella constitution. And so that's been some really important work that I've had the privilege of being a part of, and looking at that and understanding that constitution, and then working with each tribe on an education around just understanding that, but also like, what are some amendments that need to be made to that constitution? So I just think that there's so many ways to engage in our tribal governance, and I'll say that there's been so much that's been kept from us in terms of understanding our own tribal governance. And I will, I just give so much, it's so much to learn that and understand that, and then to be a part of those systems change.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think one of the things with the Zagi Bagong effort that we tried to emphasize was, for many of us who went to public school either on or off the reservation, we didn't necessarily learn about our own tribal government. We had civics class and we learned about the American political system and the structure and the founders and how it all worked. And, we sort of took that in. But then for many of us, there wasn't a parallel learning experience about our own tribal governments, our constitution. Who wrote it? When did it come about? What are our election cycles? Why is our leadership set up the way that it is, etc.? And so there is this additional learning that has to take place for us as Native people to learn multiple systems of government and how they work and what our role is in participating in those structures. And so in some ways, it's excellent that we get to participate in lots of government, but as Nevada, in other ways, it's like there's so much legislation, there's more to do and more to learn about. So sometimes that can be a little bit overwhelming in some ways to people too. So working on those issues and having a platform like we are today to talk and share a little bit more about it is really important. As we move through our conversation here, I just want to remind our viewers that you're welcome at any time to go ahead and put questions in the comments. We have a few more items to talk about on our list, but then we will turn toward your questions in a little while in the conversation. So pop them in the comments as you think of them, and we will circle back and come to talk about them towards the end of the program. But we welcome questions and comments on any of the topics that we're touching upon today. So let's move into talking a little bit more in detail about the American political system. And we'll put that graphic back in our mind briefly and thinking about Native people and citizenship. So what some viewers might know, some might not, American Indians who were not yet U.S. citizens became U.S. citizens in 1924. There was a piece of legislation that uniformly conferred American citizenship on American Indians. At that time, there were American Indians who were advocating for citizenship, and there were also American Indians who did not want U.S. citizenship. It was a divide among people, just like any group of people, there's going to be multiple opinions. And so that was true. But nonetheless, in 1924, the U.S. passed that legislation. And then I think we tend to assume that with citizenship comes voting rights, but not so. It doesn't necessarily include the right to vote. And so many states had voting laws that restricted and or suppressed American Indian voting rights after American Indians were conferred citizenship in 1924. This is something that the National Congress of American Indians took on early on, a major court case in 1948 in New Mexico. And then there were other cases across the country dealing with voting rights in states. Native people, I'll just give a few reminders here. Native people in Maine didn't receive the right to vote in national elections until 1954, and then state elections in 1967. Native people in Colorado had to pass a literacy test requirements, and they received enfranchisement to vote in 1970. And so across the nation, there were a variety of different laws in place that suppressed the vote. And we also see voter suppression even in more recent elections. In this election, but especially we can point to issues in North Dakota in the previous election cycle as well, where laws requiring physical addresses created a barrier for many American Indians who didn't necessarily have street addresses in reservation rural areas to vote. So there's some complex ways in which the government has over time suppressed or worked to suppress American Indian voting. But despite those efforts, we saw record numbers of American Indians turn out to vote in 2008, and also really great voter turnout this year in 2020 as well. And as Danielle noted at the top of the program, many American Indian and Alaska Native candidates this year, 110 overall, ran for office in the American political system. And so there has been some attention to the importance of the Native vote with regard to these elections. In particular, of course, the presidential was our big election here in 2020. Nevada, you worked on the Biden campaign here in Minnesota, and you've worked with other organizations across time in order to encourage and get out the Native vote. Do you want to talk with us a little bit about the importance and the impact of American Indian voting and participation in the American political system?
Yeah, I mean, as you're like running down that history, it's like, it's so ever present and evergreen, like how close that is to us, like those rights and having those rights. And, you know, I was born in 1976. So it's like, I've had the privilege of being able to vote in, you know, state races, federal races, and my tribal races. And, you know, when I was a young person myself, I was probably like 18 or 19, 20, like I was registering Native youth to vote as well. And part of the challenge was, you know, at that time, and I think it still is today, is that, you know, there were many parents who were like, well, we don't vote in American elections, and I'm not sure why you're trying to register my son or daughter to do this. And it was a huge education campaign, you know, that I had to do as a young person to like, help folks understand why it was important, what power is in that vote, and how we're able to make impact in our leaders and our policies and our communities. And so that work continues. I mean, I think even this year in 2020, we still have folks that say that same thing. Is like, why would I vote in American elections? Like that's not, they're not for us. They're not set up for us. They're not for us. So that education continues. I mean, on the Biden campaign this past year, we had really great like Native organizers that were working with the DFL. We had Rachel Banks Cupcho and we had Irene Falstrom that were doing outreach in community. You know, as a political director and setting strategy for Minnesota, you know, myself, it definitely part of, you know, like looking at the strategy around making sure we're engaging Native voters, registering them, and making sure that our participation was having an impact on this election was paramount for my leadership as the political director in Minnesota. Additionally, like in Minnesota, we saw there was an organization called Four Directions that came in, a national organization that they were registering people to vote. And I don't have the final numbers, but what I was hearing was that somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 new registered voters in the state of Minnesota. These are Native voters in this election cycle. So we know the impact of that. Not trying to be partisan, but like we know the impact of those votes came out in, largely in favor of Biden-Harris and helped secure the win in Minnesota. But not just in Minnesota, we saw this across the country. And I think, like many of us in Indian country saw the infographic on, I think CNN, where it's like all of the percentages of all of the different groups across the country. And then it had something else, right? And like that something else is not something else. It's American Indian people, it's tribal nations, tribal citizens. And, we talked about invisibility, and like, there's just so many ways that like media and dominant culture likes to erase us. And I think that was one way in this election cycle to be called something else when we had such a huge impact on the outcome of the election. So I think that like, kind of to debunk that whole idea that like we don't belong in these systems and voting here or running for office here, absolutely we need to be here because we need to be having that impact and that influence, and it changes things.
Right. Yeah. I think many people resonate with that little bit of conflict of should we be participating in the American political system, but actually the many laws impact us as Native people from the American political system. And so while in some ways, some people might see it as an acquiescing to, the acknowledging the colonial structure or system. Yet, how can we make that system, how can we participate in it in a way that will be beneficial, that electing people to office that will work on a nation-to-nation basis with our tribal governments, that type of thing. I've been voting in the American political system since I was 18, except for one miss. And after I missed, it was just a long, hectic, busy day, and I couldn't find the strength to make it out to the polls. And I learned a valuable lesson in the outcome of that election and started voting by mail. And one of the great things in Minnesota, it was really widely used this year, but I've been voting by mail in the absentee process for a number of years, just knowing my own schedule. And so it's helpful in states where there are less barriers to voting, and they want to make voting more accessible broadly. Jayme, would you share with us any of your thoughts and experiences in participating in the American political system?
Yeah, sure. I guess for me, my experiences kind of went backwards, for lack of a better term. My participation in politics really didn't start till later in life, because in my teens and 20s, basically, I was just trying to survive. So in my late 20s, I had gotten my position in Senator Conrad's office in DC as his Indian Affairs liaison and legislative aide. I voted and things like that, but it wasn't like advocacy. It wasn't anything that I was really passionate about at that time. But what really lit that fire was being on the inside per se and working on legislation like Violence Against Women, Indian Child Welfare Act, land, water rights. Keystone Pipeline was huge, it's still huge. Healthcare, housing, like education, everything that touched Indian country is something that I worked on. But then on the other side of that, I started to work with other Senate staffers, and on, in Congress as well. And I noticed I was one of very few Native people there working on Native issues. And I know how big of a difference that makes when, a Native is working on Native issues. It's just a whole different lens. So, it really upset me that there weren't more Native people in the House and Senate working on these issues. There are many Natives off the Hill, of course, many amazing lawyers, all kinds of Natives off the Hill that are doing great work. But in those halls, it got to be pretty lonesome some days. So for me, that's when I really decided to get involved. Not so much about the policy change at that time, but more so about getting our people to be aware and interested in these positions where they can be a heavy influencer in law and policy, and even maybe one day the goal is to create it, right? So for me, I decided to move back home and work at Turtle Mountain Community College, where I, was lucky enough to help create our leadership program here at the college in hopes of doing just that. Because I fully believe that no matter the sector you work in, if you're in the healthcare field, a teacher, welder, entrepreneur, somewhere along the line, you're going to need to advocate for our people in your sector. And you got to be prepared to step up when called upon. So that was really goal number one for me. But, also knowing that's just one side of it, because, also knowing and kind of seeing what our congressional delegations are capable of, lit another fire in me to push those running for these positions to care about our Indigenous people and our values. And when I returned home, it just so happens that was the year Heidi Heitkamp, won the North Dakota Senate seat with the help of our Native vote here in North Dakota. So that, everything just kind of came together, and, really working with some amazing people here in North Dakota to get out the Native vote just has continued to light that fire. And, I've been participating in a variety of ways ever since. So yeah, it's kind of been a process to to get where I am as far as, being an advocate and really getting out the vote. It's taken some time, but, I knowing that side of it, and knowing, at the federal level, at the state level, and now working with tribal, councils, I'm able to kind of see how everything intertwines and works together. And that's ultimately my goal personally, to have those lines of communications open, and how can we get, law and policy that is, has Indigenous values within it. So yeah, that's a little bit about my background in that.
Excellent. Yes. Yeah. Well, you both have such really broad and deep backgrounds to draw upon. We're nearing the time when we're going to start asking questions from outside. I'm going to move us to one other topic. So if you have questions, type them up in the chat and they'll queue them up for me shortly. Before we do that, I want to squeeze in a question that connects here to the American political system. And we know that a number of Native women were elected to local office in Minnesota this year, down ballot, as we say. One being Liz Jacola for the city of Cloquet. I have to give a shout out. She's an alumni from the Native Rebuilders program from Jayme's organization. So building leadership across different capacities. And Nevada, you, of course, served on the city council for Virginia up on the Iron Range. And so I'm guessing you were the first American Indian to serve on that. So I'll ask you that. And if there were any other women when you were on council, and then maybe if you have any advice or things to share for some of those new Native women who are newly elected in the American political system.
Yeah, this is so fun for me to talk about. I was the first American Indian woman ever elected on the Virginia City Council. And I'll be honest that I think that I was probably one of the first American Indian women to be elected to a city council in the state of Minnesota. I did not see people like myself in those positions of leadership. And we talked earlier again about kind of the whole diagram around state, federal, and tribal. And so, I had the privilege of kind of growing up during a time when Winona LaDuke ran with Ralph Nader to be the vice president. And so she was a huge influence in my life as a Native woman, to see her running for the highest office in the land as a vice presidential candidate, and now we finally have a woman of color in the vice presidential position, which is fantastic. But I think you need to be able to see, it's helpful if you can see others like yourselves in those positions of leadership. And so for myself on the Virginia City Council, it was a huge shift for me to make that break from thinking, okay, someday I'll run for office, but it'll probably be in my tribal community, but I don't live in my tribal community. So how am I going to be in a political leadership position? it's so crazy that something had to like click where it was like, no, I can run for public office right here. Mm-hmm. And I live in this community. I've gone to school in this community. I went to college here. I own a home here. I'm raising my children here. This is absolutely my community, and I absolutely have the ability to lead in this community. And once that, like, I made that connection, I really had to do some like deep visualization because I had never seen anything like that before. And so I think in terms of leadership, we have to, we have to like dig deep into our cultural values and our teachings in terms of like understanding we are creating things that have never been created before, and we are doing things that have never been done before. And so we have to vision ourselves into these positions of leadership and into this work, because I can guarantee that these systems do not want us there. I mean, I think they have sort of created them to lock us out. And so we have to do some really deep work, and we have to be supporting each other. So I think for myself, running and winning my election, I worked very hard, and I did the work. It was a lot of work, and I was elected 3 times before I made the decision to leave my position there. So I was on the city council for 10 years. I was for 8 of the 10 years the only woman on the council, which was also challenging to be not just an American Indian person, but also the only woman on the council. And we, Native women bring different leadership. I mean, you can see Jayme talks about all of the tribal chairs and the chiefs and the tribal presidents. We have never culturally ever considered that women should not be in leadership. That's our cultural values. And so when you go into an American political system where it's not like that, in fact, women are not are treated, I think, pretty badly in the American political system, and we don't see parity there. We don't see the leadership that we need to see. But in tribal nations, we do see that. Like we see great leadership in women. So I think Native women actually bring a lot into the American political system because we have a lot of knowledge to share. And I think there's so much around our communities that are often talked about, like the disparities and the problems and all of those things. And the reality is, no, we're like really rich in culture. We're really rich in values. We're really rich in knowledge. We know how to lead our communities, and we know how to do it really well. And so that's what we bring into the American political system. And so it's not surprising this year. I mean, I think about like Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, who's a very good friend of mine, and she and I have done work for feels like decades on like just community organizing and leadership development and bringing Native leaders into the fold and lifting them up. But I mean, just thinking through, like now we've had State Representative Susan Allen, who has since retired. I mean, first lesbian American Indian woman in the Minnesota House, right? Peggy Flanagan, State Representative, now Lieutenant Governor. Jamie Becker-Finn, State Representative. Mary Kanesh Podine, who is State Representative and now is a state senator. Newly elected Heather Keeler from Moorhead, Minnesota, new state representative. You mentioned Liz Jacula, Cloquet City Councilor. We had Renee Vanette that was elected in Duluth as the Duluth City Councilor. Audrey Thayer was just elected in Bemidji as a city council member. And I mean, we had Alan Roy who ran for state senate. I mean, he serves in his tribal nation, was not elected, but we're seeing our tribal citizens step up into these positions. And so I started to get chills a little bit when I'm reading that list, because like when I did this in 2007, there was like nobody. There was like, and it was like working to cultivate and to bring people in and to get them set up to do this. So it's really powerful work. And I see Native women as being the ones who kind of have like charged the path forward and are like continuing to do that. I don't know. I mean, the advice I have for Native women is just trust yourself. You know what you're doing. You have your ancestors, like, we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors, and we carry them with us. So I think the most important thing is just trust yourself and to lead confidently.
Thank you. Yeah, that list is great. It's so exciting to hear that that list of names, all of the American Indian women getting involved in the American political system. And I think your point is well taken as well. Our audience might not realize that for many of the tribal nations, American Indian women have been elected to the highest leadership office. So unlike the US, where we haven't seen a female president, we finally have a female vice president. We haven't seen women in the American political system in those high roles, but we certainly have seen them in a lot of our tribal nations. I know we have some questions pouring in, and so I'll invite the Danielle and to put it on the screen for me, the first question, and we'll turn over to some things that our audience want to hear more about. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us today and by participating by asking your questions. So here is the first question. In what key ways do some tribal government structures reflect the Native political systems historically rather than US systems and structures? This is a really big question. And of course, we should acknowledge the influence that American Indian governments had on the US structure. So maybe we can note that before we delve into a comparison. I think maybe not everyone is aware of the inspiration that some of the American founding fathers drew from the Haudenosaunee system of governance. So we see the Native influence on the American system. And then either of you, Jayme or Nevada, want to say just a little bit about how tribal governments today have some of those historic aspects that remain?
I can speak to, one that I know of offhand. I believe it's, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it's Red Lake, where they have had hereditary chiefs as their kind of to keep their tribal council on a path and to keep them, thinking about their people and all the decisions that they make and, the direction that they're going. That's just, one off the top of my head where, our traditional ways are coming back. I know in some of the work that we do, that's a huge conversation. Yeah. This is a huge question, but it's also a huge conversation that Native nations are having within their own structure about their constitution, and we're, kind of saying like, hey, just if you had to start from scratch with your constitution, what would you create? What would your nation want to create for your own constitution? And it doesn't have to be like we were given the IRA constitution, which many of our Native nations have that we work with, so just kind of, again, pulling them out of that sometimes decolonized way of like, this has to be this way because it's a constitution, and indigenizing that. And what is that? So, there are some, I know there's nations out there that are more indigenized, and that's just the one off the top of my head. I believe it's Red Lake.
Yeah, yes, that's perfect. And I think we'll just acknowledge for our viewers, some may know, some may not know, the IRA is the Indian Reorganization Act. And that was an act of the American political system. Speaking of the American political system's influence on tribal nations, in that legislation, the US kind of took a turn away from its assimilation efforts, which had dominated federal policy for a few decades up till that point. And what it did was recognize in many ways tribal governments, but at the same time, it had a paternalistic tone and tenor to it, in which the Bureau of Indian Affairs quite heavy-handedly, probably to put it nicely, helped tribal nations write constitutions. And those constitutions that come out of the IRA era are often dominated by an economic and business focus. No shock, it's the Great Depression going on, so that's going to be the big influence. The American political structure is looking for easy political systems to navigate the ongoing nation-to-nation relationship. And so they had a desire to influence those political structures. And I would say within the last 20 years or more, many American Indian nations are taking a look at those constitutions from the 1930s and saying, does this work for us? Does it not work for us? Like Jayme said, what kinds of constitutional reform efforts are needed and how to navigate those is a huge process. We can imagine the questions of constitutional reform in the American political system, and they are no less complicated in tribal political systems.
Yeah, I would add a couple of things that are like just kind of like you just see. I think that tribes often will also make sure that elders councils or youth councils are engaged in the political process, because tribal nations are, like culturally very intergenerational. And so the wisdom of elders is sought, and then the vision of youth is also sought, like the rising generation. Secondly, I would say that if you've ever been to a tribal council meeting, often there's food served. And I mean, I've been to a tribal council meeting where it just lasted all day. And there was never any urgency to like speed things along. Like I know our city council meetings, oftentimes they were like, get to the next item. You only have 5 minutes to speak. Like, and there's just kind of, but in tribal council meetings, it's almost like you could take the whole day and we want to hear what people have to say. And there's a little bit more patience there. Mm-hmm. And of course, those are just like pockets of things that I've seen. And I think every tribe is unique and is governed differently. And I think it's important to acknowledge that we're not homogenous. We are, as tribal nations, we have a lot of diversity in the way that we operate in our governance.
Thank you so much. I know we have a few other questions to get to, so keeping an eye on time here, I'll ask the next question to be brought forward. This question is for Nevada. Do you think that CNN intentionally left off Native American label in favor of the something else label? That's speculation. If you think that, how would you articulate, what do you think like the reason might be behind that? For our viewers, many of them saw this poll that CNN did that Nevada referenced, which showed a breakup of the US, different populations, African Americans, Asian Americans, etc. And then instead of listing American Indians, it listed something else. What do you think? Do you think that was intentional? What impact do you think it has?
So whether it was intentional or not, CNN is going to say that it was not intentional. I mean, they're going to flat out say that it was not intentional. But when you see that there are other sort of, African American, you're Asian American, like, why would you not put American Indian? Why wouldn't you put Native American in there as a category? Mm-hmm. It just doesn't make sense to put something else in there. It just doesn't make sense. And I know that they'll say, well, it was because there was maybe people that didn't identify themselves, or they didn't have a category to put in there. But the truth is that it's, in my opinion, and I think the Native community reacted very strongly to this, because this has happened to us so many times where we're like invisible, like we're not discussed. You can't even put Native American or American Indian up there. So I think whether it was intentional or not, it has an impact, and it's just not right. That's my opinion. Jayme, I'm sure you've got a response to this as well.
No, I absolutely agree. Whether or not we were part of the 6% or what, I just want us to be up there, no matter the percentage, if it's 0.15, whatever. We deserve to be up there. This is our land. This is our only home, and we deserve to be counted and recognized, no matter the percentage is how I feel about that. So whether or not it was a mistake or not, you can change that by just making sure that we're always on, as part of that group. So I think it's an easy fix.
Yeah. And I think it does. I mean, the question of incompetence leads into the need for broader education for all people about American Indians. It's not inconceivable that some intern at CNN never had American Indian Studies, never had that acknowledged. We know the problems with education and textbooks in the American education system that don't acknowledge American Indians. After 1900 or so, we sort of disappear. So it may be also a good education moment. I want to get to at least one more question as our time is running down here. All right, next question from Tamara St. John. I'm a huge advocate for equity within our tribal governments. Many tribes have codes that do not support off-reservation tribal members' voting rights. I feel that every member deserves to have a voice in their tribal government. Is this something that is talked about broadly in the work you all do? So this is a question of each tribal government has its own rules and laws around voting. And what Tamara is referencing here is some tribes have a residency. You have to live within the reservation in order to vote, and others allow voting, as Nevada talked about, for those that are living off reservation. Maybe Jayme, I'll turn to you first on this one to talk a little bit about this issue broadly.
Yeah, it's definitely, it comes up anytime there's budgeting, counting, any of that. I mean, it's just basically a question asked every year. And how do we do that? How do we move towards, because it's the question always is like, well, you live off reservation, and specifically for Turtle Mountain here, we have a 6x12 reservation. We can't fit all 35,000 ish, citizens here. So we have many off-res, but then, the question becomes, it's like, well, you don't really know what's going on here, and yet you want to vote to, kind of make changes within our lives here. But I personally, feel that yes, you're a citizen of this nation. You should have a right. You should, but there's a level of engagement that I think, is needed, is required. And I go back to our teachings that we have within our Native Nation Rebuilders program. One really great example of this is the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, which we do a case study on, and their nation in Oklahoma, they broke out the whole nation into districts. I think they have I can't remember, 16 districts. So they basically have a legislature, and the chairman there, Chairman Rocky Barrett, he has, meets with them. He has them on screen. He was, doing Zoom long before, before we were, and he met with his legislature. So each legislature has their district, and they represent, their constituents there. Every year they have a homecoming where everybody is welcome back home, but their thing is they do very well as far as funding and stuff goes, but there's always that they always require the skin in the game. They'll help you with your education, but only so much. They'll help you with housing, but only so much. So I really admire Citizen Potawatomi Nation for that, in that they're reaching out to all of their citizens, no matter where they're at, even across the world. So, and they found a way, and it didn't happen overnight, but I think having these hard conversations is very much needed to make sure that we are all engaged in our civic duty within our nations in order to be stronger. So yeah, kind of roundabout way of answering that, I guess.
No, not at all. That's great. I think you're right. Each individual nation, that's an important way in which tribal citizens can be engaged in their own nation and advocate for change and whatever they like to see in their own political structure. And that's the great thing about tribal sovereignty and American Indian nations having the power to determine how those rights are structured. Mm-hmm. We are waiting on our time here, so I have my eye on the clock. I know we have other questions we didn't get to. I have a list of questions that we were ready to get to. I think we could sit here and talk easily for several more hours, but I want to thank the Minnesota Historical Society for providing the platform for us today, and for all of the viewers that joined us live, and for those that will be joining us later in the virtual world. There is on screen here the form for anyone who would like to fill out. The Minnesota Historical Society would love to hear your thoughts on this program. Please help them out by filling out the survey so that they can have feedback on their programming and create more excellent programming for everyone to enjoy accessibly. Thank you so much, both of you, to Nevada and Jayme, to Danielle backstage, and Ned backstage, as well as the variety of people, Kate Bean and Amber Innes, who helped us get everything sorted out at the beginning. There is a lot of technical work and organizing to be done to have a session like today. So miigwech to everyone, and have a good day.